A security guard found Eleanor Mitchell sitting on the curb outside the Family Feud studio at 6:47 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. Not waiting for the doors to open, not sitting on a bench in the shade. On the curb, in the parking lot, in the dark, blind and alone, wearing a thin sweater in 42-degree weather, holding a white cane and a small purse. She'd been there since 4:15 a.m., when a taxi had dropped her off and driven away. The guard approached her carefully, assuming she was lost or confused. "Ma'am, can I help you? The studio doesn't open until 9. Eleanor turned her face toward his voice with the precise orientation of someone who'd navigated the world without sight for decades. Her voice came out weak, shaking from cold or hunger or both. "I'm supposed to be here. My family is coming to be on the show today. They told me to meet them here at 9, but I came early because I didn't know how long the taxi would take, and I didn't want to miss it." The guard noticed her lips were blue. Her hands were trembling. "Ma'am, when's the last time you ate?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said 7 words that made the guard pull out his radio immediately. "I don't remember. Maybe Sunday? Monday?" It was Wednesday. The guard called his supervisor. His supervisor called the studio production office. Someone found Steve Harvey's personal number and called it at 7:03 a.m. Steve answered. A woman's voice said, "We have an elderly blind woman who's been sitting in our parking lot since 4 a.m. She says her family is coming for a taping today, but she hasn't eaten since Sunday. We need you here now." Steve Harvey was in his hotel room. He threw on clothes and drove to the studio at 7:14 a.m. When he found Eleanor Mitchell, 81 years old, legally blind from diabetic retinopathy, sitting on a curb, shaking from cold and hunger because her family had told her to meet them at the studio, but hadn't bothered to actually bring her, he knelt down on the freezing pavement in his expensive suit and said 5 words that would change both their lives. "Ma'am, I'm taking you inside." It was January 15th, 2025, a Wednesday morning in Atlanta. The Mitchell family from Birmingham, Alabama, was scheduled to tape at 2 p.m. Eleanor Mitchell was the family matriarch, grandmother to 5 of the family members competing. Her daughter Patricia, Patricia's husband James, their 3 adult children, and 2 of Eleanor's other grandchildren made up the team. They'd been selected for the show 6 weeks earlier. Eleanor had been excited. She'd listened to Family Feud on the radio for years, memorized Steve's voice, loved the game. Her family had told her she'd be in the audience to watch them play. They'd arranged everything. Or so Eleanor had thought. What she didn't know until yesterday was that her family had run out of money. Patricia's husband, James, had lost his job 3 months ago. The family was behind on mortgage payments, utilities, everything. And Eleanor, who'd been living with Patricia and James for 11 years since her husband died, had become what Patricia called a financial strain we can no longer manage. But nobody in that parking lot knew what was about to happen. Steve helped Eleanor to her feet. She was small, frail, maybe 90 pounds. He could feel her shaking through her thin sweater. "How long have you been out here?" he asked gently. Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. "Since 4:15. The taxi driver asked if I was sure this was the right place, and I said yes because Patricia told me to come here. She said she'd meet me at 9. I came early. I didn't want to be late." Steve's jaw tightened. "Where did the taxi pick you up?" Eleanor hesitated. A place. A building. Patricia dropped me there yesterday afternoon. She said it was temporary housing until they got back from Atlanta. She said I'd stay one night and then come meet them here." Steve's voice was very careful. "What kind of place?" Eleanor's hands twisted around her cane. A shelter. For women. Patricia said it was just for one night. Steve Harvey stood in a parking lot at 7:20 in the morning, looking at an 81-year-old blind grandmother who'd been dropped at a homeless shelter, spent the night terrified and alone, taken a taxi at 4 a.m. to a television studio, and sat on a curb for 3 hours in the cold because her family had told her to meet them there but hadn't bothered to actually bring her or feed her or make sure she was safe. And something inside Steve's chest cracked open. "Let's get you inside," he said quietly. He took Eleanor's arm and guided her toward the building. The security guard opened doors. They walked through empty hallways. The building was dead at this hour. Crew wouldn't arrive for another hour. Steve took Eleanor to his dressing room, sat her down on the couch, wrapped her in his jacket. "Stay here. I'm getting you food." He left and returned 8 minutes later with coffee, orange juice, breakfast sandwiches, fruit, a bagel with cream cheese. He set everything on the table in front of Eleanor. "Can you eat?" Eleanor reached out with shaking hands. Steve guided her hand to the coffee cup. She wrapped both hands around it, absorbing the warmth. "Thank you," she whispered. Tears were running down her face behind her dark glasses. "Thank you so much." Steve sat down next to her. "Take your time. Eat slowly if your stomach's not used to food. I'm not going anywhere." Eleanor picked up half a breakfast sandwich. She took a small bite, chewed carefully, swallowed, took another bite. Steve watched her eat with an expression that was part rage, part heartbreak, part determination. After she'd eaten half the sandwich and drunk some juice, Steve spoke. "Tell me what happened. Everything. How does a grandmother end up on a curb at 4 in the morning?" Eleanor set down the sandwich. Her voice was stronger now, steadier, but still threaded with confusion and hurt. "I've been living with my daughter Patricia for 11 years. Since my husband died. Since I lost my vision. I have diabetes. That's what took my sight. I can't live alone anymore. Patricia and James took me in. They said family takes care of family. I helped where I could. I couldn't see to cook or clean, but I could fold laundry if someone handed it to me. I could listen to the grandchildren practice their reading. I tried not to be a burden." And that wasn't even the part that made Steve cry. 3 months ago, James lost his job. Money got tight. I understood. I receive $1,100 a month in Social Security. I gave it all to Patricia for my expenses. She said it wasn't enough. She said I cost more than that in food, medicine, utilities, the aide who comes twice a week to help me bathe. She said they were drowning financially and couldn't keep supporting me. I told her I was sorry. I told her I'd eat less. I started skipping meals to save money. I'd tell them I'd already eaten, but I could hear it in Patricia's voice. She was tired of me. I was a weight around her neck. Eleanor's voice cracked. Yesterday morning, she told me they'd found temporary housing for me while they went to Atlanta for the show. She said it was a nice place. She said I'd be comfortable. She drove me there. She walked me to the door. She said someone would help me get settled. Then she left. Steve's hands were clenched into fists. What happened at the shelter? Eleanor took a shaky breath. It wasn't nice. It was loud. People were arguing. Someone was crying. A woman checked me in and took me to a bed in a room with 20 other beds. She told me dinner was at 5. I sat on the bed. I was too scared to move. I couldn't see where I was. I couldn't navigate. I didn't know where the bathroom was. A woman helped me, another resident, not staff. She took me to dinner. It was soup and bread. I ate some. Then she walked me back to the bed. I sat there all night. I couldn't sleep. I didn't know if my things were safe. I only had my purse and my cane. I was terrified someone would take them. At 3:30 in the morning, I asked someone to call me a taxi. I told them I needed to get to the Family Feud studio by 9. The shelter staff said they couldn't call taxis for residents. Another woman gave me her phone and helped me call. The taxi came at 4. I got here at 4:15. The driver asked if I was sure. I said yes. I had $137 in my purse, everything I had left after giving Patricia my Social Security. I paid the taxi. Then I sat down to wait. She turned her face toward Steve. I thought Patricia would come get me. I thought we'd go inside together. I thought I'd hear them play. I didn't understand that they weren't planning to bring me, that I was just supposed to stay there, at the shelter, forever. Steve Harvey stood up. He walked across the room and stood with his back to Eleanor for 15 seconds. His shoulders were shaking. When he turned around, his face was wet with tears and his voice was rough with barely controlled rage. Your daughter dropped you at a homeless shelter, told you it was temporary, left you there terrified and alone, and then came to Atlanta to play a game show for money while you sat in a parking lot for 3 hours in the cold, having not eaten since Sunday. Is that correct? Eleanor nodded slowly. I think so. Yes. Steve pulled out his phone. What's your daughter's number? Eleanor recited it. Steve dialed. It rang 4 times. A woman answered, sleepy. Hello? Steve's voice came out cold and hard. Patricia Mitchell? This is Steve Harvey. I'm at the Family Feud studio with your mother. She's been sitting in my parking lot since 4 o'clock this morning. She hasn't eaten since Sunday. She spent last night in a homeless shelter where you dropped her. And you were planning to come here at 2 p.m. to play my show for money, while your 81-year-old blind mother sits homeless. Is that correct? Silence on the other end. Then Patricia's voice, defensive. Who is this? How did you… Steve cut her off. I said this is Steve Harvey. Answer the question. Did you drop your mother at a shelter yesterday? More silence. Then, we couldn't afford to keep her anymore. We don't have money for… Steve's voice rose. So you dropped her at a shelter and flew to Atlanta to be on television. Do you understand what you've done? Do you have any concept of how cruel that is? Patricia's voice came back angry now. You don't understand our situation. We're drowning. James lost his job. We have 3 kids. We can't afford… Steve interrupted again. I don't care what you can't afford. You don't throw away your blind mother like garbage because keeping her alive is inconvenient. You're not playing on my show. You're banned from this building. And I'm going to make sure your mother never has to see you again. Which is ironic, since she's blind and can't see you anyway. But she can hear you. And what she's been hearing is that her own daughter values money more than her life. He hung up. Patricia tried to call back immediately. Steve blocked the number. He turned back to Eleanor, who was crying silently, tears running down her face from behind her dark glasses. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry you had to do that. I'm sorry I'm causing trouble. I should just go back. Steve cut her off gently. No, you're not going back anywhere. You're staying with me until we figure this out. And we're going to figure it out right now. He made another call. A woman answered, Steve? It's 7:30 in the morning. Steve said, Becky, I need emergency housing for an elderly blind woman. Fully accessible apartment in Atlanta or Birmingham, her choice. And I need an aid service set up for daily assistance. And I need it done by this afternoon. She's not spending another night in a shelter. Becky, to her credit, didn't ask questions. I'll handle it. Text me her information. But Steve wasn't done. He made 5 more calls in rapid succession. A benefits attorney to review Eleanor's Social Security and explore additional assistance. A case manager from an elder advocacy organization specializing in vision loss. A diabetic care specialist to review her medications. an accessible housing coordinator, and a home care agency. By the end of 30 minutes, Eleanor had a fully accessible one-bedroom apartment in Birmingham starting next week, with 6 months of rent prepaid, a home health aide scheduled for daily visits, a benefits review appointment to maximize her assistance, transportation services set up for medical appointments, and grocery delivery arranged. Steve sat back down next to Eleanor. "You're not homeless anymore. I'm taking care of this." Eleanor was shaking her head, crying, "I can't accept this. It's too much. You don't even know me." Steve took her hands. "Let me tell you something. My father went blind from diabetes when he was 71. Same thing that happened to you, diabetic retinopathy. For 5 years, until he died, my mother took care of him, bathed him, fed him, guided him, read to him, made sure he didn't feel like a burden. She never once complained. She never once suggested he was too expensive to keep. Because that's what love looks like when someone needs you." His voice broke. "Your daughter didn't learn that, but I did. And I'm going to make sure you're cared for the way my father was, because you deserve that. Every elderly person deserves that." Eleanor was sobbing now, deep, shaking sobs. "No one's been kind to me in so long," she choked out. "I thought I was just in the way, just a problem to solve." Steve pulled her into a hug. "You're not a problem. You're a person, and you matter. And I'm going to prove it to you." He held her while she cried, this 81-year-old blind grandmother who'd spent a night in a shelter and 3 hours on a curb because her own daughter had calculated her value and found it wanting. When Eleanor's crying slowed, Steve said quietly, "I'm going to do one more thing. Is that okay?" Eleanor nodded. Steve pulled his phone out again. He dialed. A woman answered, elderly voice, warm. "Steve? Baby, why are you calling so early?" Steve said, "Mama, I'm with an elderly blind woman named Eleanor. Her daughter dropped her at a homeless shelter yesterday and came to Atlanta to be on my show. Eleanor spent the night terrified and then sat in my parking lot for 3 hours in the cold. She hasn't eaten since Sunday. I need you to talk to her. I need you to tell her she's not a burden." Eloise Harvey was quiet for a moment. Then her voice came through firm and gentle. "Put her on." Steve handed his phone to Eleanor. Eleanor took it with shaking hands. "Hello?" Eloise's voice filled the phone. "Eleanor, baby, my name is Eloise Harvey. I'm Steve's mother. I'm 97 years old. My husband went blind from diabetes in 1995. I took care of him until he died in 2000. And I want you to know something. You are not too expensive. You are not a burden. You are a human being who deserves care and dignity and love. Your daughter failed you. That's not your fault. That's her shame, not yours. Do you hear me?" Eleanor was crying again. "Yes, ma'am," Eloise continued. "Good. Now my son is going to take care of you. You're going to let him. You're not going to apologize. You're not going to feel guilty. You're going to accept help because you've earned it, just by surviving to 81 with grace. Understood?" Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, ma'am." Eloise said, "Good. Now eat your breakfast. Steve said he brought you food. You eat every bite. I want you strong. You hear me?" Eleanor laughed through tears. "Yes, ma'am." Eloise said, "Good girl. Now hand me back to my son." Steve took the phone back. "Thanks, Mama." Eloise said, "You call me after you get her settled, and you make sure that daughter of hers knows what she's done. Shame works when nothing else will." Steve said he would, and hung up. He turned back to Eleanor. "My mother's right. You're eating all of this." He guided her hands to the rest of the food. Eleanor ate slowly. Another half sandwich, some fruit, the bagel. Steve watched her eat and made mental notes. Shaking hands, slow movements, extreme fragility, signs of prolonged malnutrition. When she'd finished, he said, "The show tapes at 2. Your daughter was supposed to be here. She's not coming. But you are. You're going to sit in the audience and watch a different family play. And I'm going to introduce you to everyone and tell them your story. Is that okay?" Eleanor's face showed fear. "You don't have to tell people. It's embarrassing." Steve's voice was gentle but firm. "It's not embarrassing. It's true. And people need to know what happens to elderly people when families decide they're too expensive. If you let me tell your story, we can help other people. People in situations like yours. People who need someone to see them." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Okay. If it helps someone else. Okay." At 1:45 p.m., Steve Harvey walked Eleanor Mitchell into the Family Feud studio. The audience was already seated. A different family was backstage ready to play. The Mitchell slot had been cancelled. Steve guided Eleanor to a seat in the front row, made sure she was comfortable, had water, had snacks. Then he walked onto stage for the pre-show warm-up. He stood at his podium and addressed the audience directly. "Before we start today's show, I need to tell you a story. This morning at 6:47 a.m., a security guard found an 81-year-old blind woman sitting on a curb in our parking lot. She'd been there since 4:15. She hadn't eaten since Sunday. She'd spent last night in a homeless shelter. Why? Because her daughter dropped her there yesterday and then flew here to play this show for money. That woman is Eleanor Mitchell. She's sitting in the front row right now, and we're going to make sure she's never homeless again." The audience was dead silent. Steve continued, "Eleanor's story isn't unique. Right now, thousands of elderly blind people are being abandoned by their families because keeping them alive costs money, and our society has decided that elderly disabled people are disposable. That ends today. I'm launching the Eleanor Mitchell Vision and Housing Fund, emergency housing and care for elderly blind people who've been abandoned. I'm funding the first $5 million personally, and we're going to make sure that every Eleanor Mitchell out there knows someone sees them, even if they can't see themselves." The audience erupted in applause. Steve walked down to Eleanor's seat, knelt beside her, and said into his microphone, "Eleanor, I want you to stand up." Eleanor stood slowly, Steve helping her. The audience gave her a standing ovation that lasted 42 seconds. Eleanor stood there crying, holding Steve's hand, listening to 360 strangers applaud her existence. When the applause died down, Steve said, "You matter. Your life has value, and anyone who tells you otherwise is wrong." He guided her back to her seat. The show taped. Eleanor listened to every minute, laughing at Steve's jokes, applauding when families won, experiencing the show she'd loved for years. And the real story hadn't even started yet. Steve posted a 24-minute video to YouTube on January 17, 2025. The video showed footage from his dressing room, Eleanor eating breakfast, crying, telling her story. It showed the phone call with Patricia, the calls arranging housing, the moment Eleanor stood and received a standing ovation. Steve's narration explained diabetic retinopathy, elder abandonment, the economics of disability. He announced the Eleanor Mitchell Vision and Housing Fund with specific details. The video ended with Steve saying, "If you're an elderly blind person who's been abandoned, apply to this fund. We will house you. We will feed you. We will make sure you're cared for with dignity. And if you're a family member who's abandoned an elderly blind person because they're too expensive, watch this and understand what you've done. Then fix it. Not for me, for them. The video was viewed 947 million times in its first week. Within 72 hours, Eleanor Mitchell and Steve Harvey Blind Grandmother were trending globally. The response was overwhelming. The fund received over 18,000 applications in the first 5 days from elderly blind people experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity. Donations poured in. Within 2 weeks, the fund had grown from Steve's initial $5 million to $83 million. Within a month, housing partnerships had been established in 42 states. Organizations serving the blind reached out to collaborate. The story became a referendum on how society treats elderly, disabled people, on who deserves housing and care, on the invisible abandonment happening in shelters and nursing homes across the country. Patricia Mitchell released a statement 6 days after the video. "I made a devastating choice under financial pressure. I failed my mother in the worst possible way. I'm working to bring her home and rebuild trust that I've destroyed. I'm ashamed and I'm sorry." The statement was met with fury. Comments sections exploded with people saying, "Sorry wasn't enough. Actions were required. Eleanor deserved better than an apology." 3 weeks later, Patricia and her family purchased a small, accessible house in Birmingham in Eleanor's name. They established a care fund. They hired full-time assistants. They tried to rebuild. Eleanor accepted their help, but chose to maintain distance. "I forgive them," she said in an interview, "but I don't trust them anymore. Trust is earned, and they spent it all." Eleanor moved into her accessible apartment in Birmingham on January 22, 2025. Steve flew in for move-in day. He walked her through the apartment, describing every room, every piece of furniture, making sure she could navigate safely. He set up her radio so she could listen to Family Feud. He made sure the aid service was properly established. Eleanor stood in her own apartment, her own space, where she'd never be thrown out, and cried. "I thought I was going to die in that shelter," she whispered. "I thought that was the end." Steve said, "It's not the end. It's the beginning of the part where someone finally sees you." 6 months after being found on the curb, Eleanor appeared on Good Morning America with Steve. She looked transformed, healthier, stronger, steady. When asked what changed, she said simply, "Someone saw me. That's all it took. I was invisible to my own daughter, but a stranger saw me sitting on a curb and decided I mattered. That's all anyone needs, to be seen." When asked about the fund named after her, Eleanor said, "I hope every person who feels invisible applies, because I know what that feels like. And I know what it feels like when someone finally looks at you and says, 'You're not garbage, you're a person.' That feeling is what the fund gives people. Not just housing, visibility." 1 year after the parking lot, the Eleanor Mitchell Vision and Housing Fund had housed over 6,000 elderly blind people. The fund provided fully accessible apartments, home health aides, transportation services, and social connection programs. The success rate was 94%. People housed through the fund remained stably housed after 2 years. The fund partnered with blindness organizations to advocate for policy changes in elder care and disability rights. Eleanor served as the fund's public face, speaking at events, sharing her story, reminding people that abandonment isn't a personal failure, but a societal choice. 3 years later, Eleanor is 84. She lives independently in her accessible apartment with daily aid support. Her vision hasn't returned. Diabetic retinopathy is permanent. But her life has been rebuilt. She has friends from the local senior center. She has hobbies, audiobooks, tactile art classes, a garden she maintains with help. She has dignity. Her daughter visits monthly. The relationship is cordial but careful, loaded with what happened but trying to move forward. Eleanor's grandchildren visit more often. They were horrified when they learned what their mother had done, and they've worked to rebuild connection with their grandmother. The family is healing slowly, imperfectly, in the way families do after trust has been shattered. Steve Harvey posted a photo on Instagram in January 2028, 3 years to the day after finding Eleanor on the curb. The photo showed Eleanor in her apartment, smiling, holding a plant she'd grown with help from her aide. The caption was 6 words. She was invisible. Now she's seen. The post received 137 million likes. Comments flooded in from elderly blind people who'd been housed by the fund, from families who'd confronted their own failures after watching Eleanor's story, from people who'd learned that abandonment isn't inevitable, but chosen. To date, the original video has been viewed over 1.4 billion times across all platforms. It's been used in disability rights advocacy worldwide. It's been referenced in elder care reform legislation. A documentary about Eleanor and the epidemic of elder abandonment premiered at Sundance in 2027. 8 states have passed laws requiring family notification before elderly disabled people are placed in shelters. Eleanor's laws. Elder advocacy organizations cite Eleanor's case as the turning point in national awareness of elder abandonment.